In rainy London, young artist Rosalind guards a secret. In her modest studio, silk canvases spring to life under delicate brushstrokes. Torn between an unmissable offer in Paris and the burden of protecting her family, she finds refuge only in the enigmatic gaze of the Duke of Hawksbury. What Rosalind doesn't know is that the mysterious collector who bought all her forgotten works over the years has always been him. Between the duty of nobility and the courage of true love, a single waltz can change the destiny of both forever. The rhythmic patter of rain against the window pane filled the quiet London studio, weaving seamlessly with the damp, earthy scent of fresh watercolors and pressed linen. Rosalind Fairchild sat at her weathered oak desk, a steady hand guiding her fine-tipped brush over the taut, pale fabric before her. It was a delicate silk fan with painted flowers. The intricate petals of a blooming blush rose slowly coming to life under her careful, deliberate strokes. For a young woman of 25 who had spent the better part of a decade quietly shielding her younger sisters from the harsh realities of their orphaned state, this modest room, tucked away from the clamor of the city, was her only true sanctuary. She paused, letting the brush hover above the silk. The soft grey light of the afternoon cast long, gentle shadows across the wooden floorboards, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the chilled air. Beside her porcelain mixing palette lay a stiff, cream-colored envelope. The heavy wax seal had been broken hours ago. It was a formal invitation to Paris, a prestigious artistic apprenticeship offered by one of the continent's most renowned botanical illustrators. Her recent, sudden influx of high society commissions had caught the attention of masters abroad. Acceptance would mean undeniable financial security for her family, guaranteeing her sisters their independence and safety for years to come. It was the profound answer to every silent prayer she had whispered into the dark over the years. Yet, as she stared at the elegant cursive on the letter, a deep and hollow loneliness settled heavily over her chest. Paris was an entirely different world. To leave London meant leaving the only life she had managed to build from the ashes of her family's ruin. It meant becoming entirely invisible once more, just another working artisan blending into the background of a sprawling foreign city. She dipped her brush into a small porcelain dish of water, watching the crimson pigment bleed and swirl into the clear liquid. She had spent so long being relentlessly useful, being the quiet foundation for others to build their happiness upon, that she hardly knew what it meant to simply belong somewhere for herself. The rain quickened outside, blurring the bustling street below her window into washes of grey and muted brown. She carefully dabbed her brush onto a scrap of linen, preparing to add the final sage-green leaves to the fan's delicate border. The quiet rustle of silk paper beneath her hands was a familiar, anchoring comfort, grounding her in the present moment. She would finish this particular piece for Lady Beatrice. She would finish the remaining commissions of the season, and then she would finally have to decide. A gentle knock at the studio door broke the stillness. Rosalind blinked, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as she immediately recognized the specific, measured cadence of that knock. It was not the hurried transactional rap of a courier, nor the demanding strike of an impatient client from the ton. "Come in," she called softly, setting her brush across the rim of the water dish. The door opened with a quiet creak, and Julian Sterling stepped into the modest room. The Duke of Hawksbury was a man whose presence usually commanded immediate deference, burdened by the immense weight of a massive, demanding estate and a title he wore like a heavy suit of armor. At 32, his sharp features were striking, but often masked by an impeccably polite, weary distance that kept high society comfortably at arm's length. But here, crossing the threshold of her studio, the rigid, formal posture of the Duke seemed to miraculously dissolve, leaving only Julian. He carefully closed the door behind him, bringing with him the faint, clean scent of rain-dampened wool and crisp autumn air. "I apologize for the intrusion, Miss Fairchild," he said, his voice a low, steady timbre that immediately warmed the damp chill of the room. "I hope I am not interrupting a delicate stage of your work." Rosalind offered a genuine, unhurried smile, the familiar tightness in her chest easing for the first time all day. "You are never an intrusion, Your Grace. I was just adding the final details to Lady Beatrice's commission." Julian stepped closer, his dark eyes sweeping over the scattered sketches, the open jars of vibrant pigment, and the letter resting precariously near the edge of her desk. He did not comment on the envelope, though his gaze lingered on it for a fraction of a second. Instead, he stopped a respectful distance from her chair, clasping his hands loosely behind his back. The heavy, warm wool of his dark coat absorbed the meager afternoon light, yet his expression was remarkably soft. "My aunt is exceedingly eager to see it," Julian murmured, his gaze dropping to the work desk, "though I suspect she uses her commissions primarily as a convenient excuse to send me here to check on your progress." "She is a generous patron," Rosalind replied, picking up a piece of fresh silk paper to carefully cover a completed section of the fan. The soft rustle filled the quiet space between them, "and I truly do not mind the supervision." Julian watched her hands as she moved, his guarded demeanor completely abandoned in the quiet safety of her studio. For a man who had been emotionally abandoned by parents who valued status above all else, who lived in constant, quiet fear of being valued only for his wealth, this small room was a profound revelation. He watched the way she treated the delicate silk fan with painted flowers, with deep reverence, patience, and absolute care. It was the exact same way she treated the people around her. It was the way she treated him. "The detailing is extraordinary," he said quietly, leaning just a fraction closer to observe the blush rose. "You capture the absolute fragility of it so perfectly, yet the stem looks strong enough to weather any storm." Rosalind looked up, her gaze catching his. There was a quiet, undeniable yearning in his dark eyes, an unspoken trust that made her breath catch slightly in her throat. She felt suddenly, wonderfully seen, not as a useful artisan, not as a convenient confidant for the nobility, but as Rosalind. A flower must have a strong foundation if it is to survive the changing seasons, she answered softly. Julian held her gaze for a lingering moment, his eyes reflecting a deep, unwavering respect that settled warmly over her heart. He offered a small, reassuring smile that made the crowded, isolating world outside the window simply fade away. Indeed, it must. The oppressive heat of the crowded drawing room, heavy with the scent of cloying perfumes and burning beeswax, slowly began to fracture the fragile peace they had discovered by the hearth. Julian, ever attuned to the subtle, unspoken shifts in her demeanor, noticed the slight tightening of Rosalind's grip on her delicate silk fan with painted flowers. Without a word, he offered his arm. He guided her away from the glittering, overwhelming tide of high society, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the townhouse until the chaotic noise of the string quartet faded into a distant, muted hum. He led her to the grand library, a vast, two-story sanctuary of polished mahogany and emerald green velvet. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, the absolute quiet of the room enveloped them like a protective embrace. The air here was wonderfully cool and breathed of history, carrying the deeply comforting scent of cracked leather bindings, dry parchment, and the faint, lingering aroma of pipe tobacco. It was Julian's private refuge, a place fiercely guarded against the intrusive demands of the ton. To be invited inside was a profound gesture of trust. A solitary lamp burned steadily on a low, circular table near a large bay window, illuminating a silver tray set with a simple china tea service. Rosalind took a seat in one of the plush, high-backed armchairs, setting her delicate silk fan with painted flowers carefully onto the table beside the tray. The quiet familiarity of the space allowed her to finally exhale, releasing the rigid, perfect posture required by the ballroom. Julian moved to the small table, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he poured the steaming amber liquid. The delicate clink of porcelain teacups against the saucers rang out clearly in the silent room, a domestic, grounding sound that made the grand library feel intimately small. He offered her a cup, their fingers brushing fleetingly against the warm china. "You looked as though you were carrying the weight of the entire room on your shoulders," Julian said quietly, taking the chair opposite hers. He did not sit with the stiff formality of a duke receiving a guest. Rather, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, giving her his complete and undivided attention. Rosalind looked down at the dark, fragrant tea, tracing the gilded rim of the cup with her thumb. The absolute safety of his presence, the way he looked at her without expectation or demand, finally broke the dam holding back her anxieties. "I received a letter this morning," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper in the vast room. "From Paris, an offer for a permanent botanical apprenticeship with Monsieur Delacroix." Julian grew perfectly still. The ambient warmth of the library suddenly felt incapable of chasing away the profound cold that settled over his chest. Paris. The word echoed in his mind, carrying the terrifying, undeniable reality of an ocean between them. For a man who had spent his entire life building emotional walls, Rosalind had become the single, indispensable source of light in his otherwise solitary existence. The thought of his quiet studio visits ending, of never again watching her carefully paint delicate petals onto silk, threatened to tear away the very foundation of his fragile peace. Yet, Julian was a man who had been taught that love was measured by sacrifice, not possession. He looked at the subtle exhaustion shadowing her eyes, remembering the years she had spent sacrificing her own youth to raise her sisters. She had earned this triumph. He could not, he would not, allow his own selfish fear of loneliness to become an obstacle to her long-overdue success. "That is an extraordinary honor," Julian managed to say, his voice perfectly steady, though his hands gripped his teacup tight enough to turn his knuckles white. "Delacroix is a master. He would be fortunate to have an artist of your caliber." Rosalind looked up, searching his face. She needed him to ask her to stay. She needed a reason to choose herself, to choose this quiet, undeniable bond over the practical demands of survival. "It would mean security for my sisters," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "But it would also mean leaving the only life I know. It means leaving London." Julian carefully set his cup down beside her delicate silk fan with painted flowers. He reached across the small space between them, offering his hand. Rosalind did not hesitate, placing her palm against his. His fingers curled gently around hers, a warm, solid anchor in the sea of her uncertainty. "The unknown is always terrifying, Rosalind," Julian murmured, his thumb brushing slowly, soothingly across the back of her hand. "But you are the strongest, most capable woman I have ever known. Do not let fear diminish your brilliance." He swallowed hard, forcing the agonizing truth of his devotion deep down behind the armor of a gentleman. "And please know this, no matter where your art takes you, no matter what shore you stand upon, I will always be your friend. You will never be without a sanctuary so long as I am drawing breath." The profound, selfless generosity of his promise brought a sudden stinging moisture to her eyes. It was exactly what a noble, honorable friend should say, yet it was the very last thing her heart wanted to hear. The conversation naturally fell away, leaving a heavy, achingly tender silence in its wake. The emotional toll of the evening, combined with the agonizing weight of her impending decision, suddenly caught up with her. The adrenaline of the ballroom faded, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Rosalind slowly withdrew her hand, resting her head briefly against the high velvet back of the armchair. She closed her eyes, the rhythmic, steady sound of the rain beginning to lightly tap against the library windows, lulling her toward sleep. Julian remained perfectly still, watching the soft rise and fall of her breathing. He studied the graceful curve of her neck, the faint, elegant shadows cast by the lamplight across her cheek, and the quiet vulnerability of her resting form. The urge to pull her into his arms, to beg her to remain by his side forever, roared furiously in his mind. Instead, he chose the only path his guarded heart believed was safe. He stood up, moving with practiced, silent grace so as not to disturb her. The library had grown significantly cooler as the hour grew late. Julian slipped off his heavy, dark evening coat. He stepped behind her chair, the faint scent of old paper and cedar wood enveloping them both. With absolute reverence, he silently draped the warm garment over her shoulders, carefully tucking the lapels inward so it acted as a thick, insulated blanket. Rosalind stirred slightly, turning her cheek into the soft, luxurious fabric. The heavy, warm wool of the Duke's coat retained the comforting heat of his body, carrying his distinct, clean scent. Even on the edge of sleep, the gentle weight of the garment made her feel completely, unconditionally protected. It was an act of pure physical caretaking, bound strictly within the respectful limits of their friendship, yet it spoke volumes of a devotion he was too terrified to voice. Julian stood behind her for a long time, his hand resting lightly on the wooden frame of her chair, watching over her as she slept, silently promising to protect her dreams, even if it meant breaking his own heart to do so. Rosalind drifted upward from the soft, velvety edges of sleep, pulled back into the waking world by the rhythmic, steady ticking of a distant grandfather clock. For a moment, she remained perfectly still, anchored by a profound and unfamiliar warmth. The fire in the grand library's hearth had burned down to a low, glowing bed of crimson embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the towering shelves of books. She shifted slightly, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the Duke's dark evening coat still draped securely around her shoulders. The fine wool carried the distinct, clean scent of cedar and crisp autumn air, Julian's scent. She slowly sat up, catching the coat before it could slip from her shoulders. The sprawling townhouse was entirely silent, the chaotic energy of the high society soiree having long since faded into the night. She was entirely alone in the vast room. The small porcelain teacups on the low table had been cleared away while she slept, but her delicate silk fan with painted flowers remained exactly where she had left it, resting like a solitary white dove against the polished mahogany wood. She picked up the fan, her thumb instinctively tracing the smooth wooden guard. As she stood, folding the heavy coat carefully over the back of the armchair, she noticed a narrow line of warm, golden light spilling across the patterned Persian rug. It emanated from a partially open, heavy oak door situated in the far corner of the library, previously hidden by the deep shadows of the room. It was the entrance to an adjoining chamber, likely the Duke's private study. Assuming Julian had retreated there to work, Rosalind walked softly across the room, intending to simply return his coat and express her gratitude for his unyielding patience. The thick rug absorbed the sound of her footsteps. As she reached the threshold, she gently pushed the heavy oak door open just a few inches wider. The private study was a stark contrast to the sprawling grandeur of the main library. It was an intimate, remarkably unpretentious room, lined with practical, leather-bound ledgers, rolled architectural maps, and correspondence regarding his massive estate. This was the quiet, demanding world of the Duke of Hawksbury, a place of constant responsibility and heavy burden. Yet, it was not the towering stacks of paper that drew Rosalind's attention. Occupying the entirety of the far wall, illuminated perfectly by a pair of low-burning oil lamps, was a magnificent mahogany display cabinet. Rosalind stepped fully into the room, her breath catching softly in her throat. She approached the wall slowly, as if moving through water. The pristine, dust-free glass of the display cabinet reflected the golden light of the lamps. But it was the objects resting behind the glass that made her heart stop entirely. arranged with absolute, painstaking reverence upon individual stands of crushed midnight blue velvet, were dozens of hand-painted silk fans. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the cool glass, her eyes wide with disbelief as she recognized her own brushstrokes. There, on the middle shelf, rested the pale bluebell fan she had painted nearly 4 years ago, one of her very first creations. Beside it sat the wild lavender design she had spent weeks perfecting, a piece her merchant agent had claimed was purchased by a mysterious, eccentric collector traveling from the north. On the top shelf, displayed like a crown jewel, was the intricate fern and blackberry silk fan that had single-handedly paid for her youngest sister's winter coat during their most difficult, destitute season. These were her unsold pieces, the fans that the glittering ladies of the ton had deemed too subdued, too natural, or simply uninteresting. The pieces she had poured her entire soul into, only to be told they lacked the ostentatious flair required by high society. Her agent had always managed to find that anonymous, generous buyer just when her family's financial situation grew most desperate. The mysterious buyer from the north had never existed. It had always been Julian. A profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude crashed over her, so powerful it brought a sudden, stinging moisture to her eyes. For years, long before they had formed their quiet, comfortable friendship, the Duke of Hawksbury had been silently watching from the shadows. He had been quietly ensuring her survival, protecting her family's independence, and validating her artistic spirit without ever once stepping forward to claim the credit. He had never used his wealth to demand her time, nor had he ever leveraged his generosity to force an obligation. He had simply, selflessly, kept her safe. A floorboard creaked in the hallway just outside the study. Rosalind turned, clutching her delicate silk fan with painted flowers tightly against her chest. Julian stood in the doorway, having just returned with a fresh scuttle of coal to revive the library's dying fire. When he saw her standing before the illuminated cabinet, the heavy brass scuttle nearly slipped from his grasp. The impeccable, formal mask of the Duke vanished entirely, leaving him utterly exposed. He stood frozen in the doorway, the very picture of a man who had just had his most fiercely guarded vulnerability dragged into the light. He did not attempt to make a polite excuse. He did not look away. "You bought them," Rosalind whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The absolute magnitude of his devotion resonated in the small, quiet room. "All those years ago, when we barely knew one another, it was always you." Julian slowly set the brass scuttle onto the floor. He stepped into the study, closing the door gently behind him to ensure their absolute privacy. He moved toward her, stopping a respectful distance away, his hands resting heavily at his sides. The weary distance in his dark eyes had been replaced by an agonizing, beautiful honesty. "I saw the bluebell fan at a merchant's stall near Covent Garden," Julian said, his voice a low, ragged murmur that betrayed the depth of his long-held secret. "It was the most extraordinary, honest thing I had ever seen. The merchant told me the artist was struggling to secure commissions because her work was considered too delicate for the current fashion. I could not bear the thought of such genuine beauty being discarded by a society that only values the superficial." He took a single, cautious step closer, his gaze dropping briefly to the delicate silk fan with painted flowers she held against her heart, before rising to meet her eyes once more. "I instructed my agent to purchase any piece you failed to sell," Julian confessed quietly, laying his heart entirely bare. "I wanted to ensure you could always afford to paint exactly what you wished, without the burden of compromising your art to survive." Rosalind looked at the magnificent cabinet, at the pristine, dust-free glass protecting her life's work, and then back to the remarkable man standing before her. The deep, lingering fear that she was invisible to high society, that her gentle nature made her forgettable, completely evaporated. She had never been invisible to him. "You kept them perfectly preserved," she noted, her voice trembling with an undeniable, fierce devotion. You built a sanctuary for them. Julian closed the remaining distance between them. He did not touch her, but his presence wrapped around her like the warmest, most protective embrace she had ever known. He looked down at her. The unconditional respect and deep yearning he had hidden for years finally allowed to surface. I built a sanctuary for them because they are yours, Rosalind, he admitted quietly, his words hanging in the intimate space between them. I cherish everything you create, not merely because it is magnificent art, but because it is a piece of you. The golden glow of the study lamps seemed to recede, leaving only the profound gravity of Julian's confession lingering in the air. Rosalind stood frozen, her heart racing, not with fear, but with the terrifying, beautiful realization of a love far deeper than any she had ever dared to imagine. Yet, even as the silence wrapped around them like an unspoken vow, the heavy, inescapable shadow of the letter resting in her London desk rose up to pull them back to reality. Paris. Julian saw the subtle, shifting shadow cross her features. He saw the exact moment the joy of his revelation collided with the cruel, ticking clock of her impending departure. His jaw tightened, the old familiar terror gripping his chest. For years, he had convinced himself that his duty was to protect her, to step aside and ensure her happiness, even if it meant sacrificing his own. The noble sacrifice. If he truly loved her, he could not anchor her to his lonely estate just to satisfy his own desperate need for companionship. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much for her family, and earned too much renown to be sidelined by his quiet burdens. He took a slow step backward, deliberately putting physical distance between them. The warmth that had filled his eyes seconds before was carefully, painfully replaced by the rigid, formal armor of the Duke of Hawksbury. You must not let my lingering sentimentality alter your course, Miss Fairchild, Julian said, his voice dropping into a smooth, measured register that felt entirely foreign after their moment of raw honesty. He straightened his shoulders, forcing his hands behind his back. The apprenticeship in Paris is the pinnacle of your artistic career. To remain here in London, managing small local commissions, would be a tragic waste of your extraordinary talent. Rosalind stared at him, the sudden, icy shift in his demeanor cutting sharper than any blade. My aunt will ensure your remaining commissions here are handled with absolute discretion, he continued, smoothly interrupting her, his gaze deliberately drifting past her shoulder to avoid the fierce, questioning fire in her eyes. And your display, it will remain protected here, exactly as it is. You have my solemn word as a gentleman. Every word was calculated to push her away, to free her from any sense of obligation, and to drive her straight toward the future he was terrified of building without her. It was noble, it was entirely selfless, and it was breaking his own heart with every single syllable. The cold draft of the empty hallway seemed to seep under the study door, chilling the air between them. Rosalind's chest tightened, but a fierce, quiet resolve, the same steady resilience that had carried her through years of hardship, blossomed within her. She realized with sudden clarity what he was doing. He was sacrificing his own happiness because he still believed he was only a burden, a guarded duke whose love was a risk rather than a refuge. He was stepping aside because he loved her too much to stand in her way. "And what of you, Your Grace?" Rosalind asked, her voice ringing out clear, steady, and entirely unyielding in the quiet room. Julian stopped, his jaw clenching tightly as he met her gaze once more. "My duties are here, Rosalind. They have always been here." "You speak of duty as though it is a shield, Julian," she whispered, taking a slow step toward him, refusing to let him hide behind his title. "You have spent your entire life protecting everyone else, ensuring everyone else is safe, while you stand alone in the cold. Who protects the Duke?" Julian looked down at her, the carefully constructed mask of absolute indifference cracking under the weight of her profound empathy. He opened his mouth to offer another practiced, polite dismissal, but the words died in his throat. He could not lie to her anymore. Not after she had seen his heart laid bare behind the glass cabinet. Seeing the raw, agonizing conflict tearing him apart, Rosalind did not wait for him to speak. She gently set her delicate silk fan with painted flowers down onto the mahogany table between them, turned, and walked out of the study. She left him standing alone in the golden lamplight, his noble sacrifice hanging heavily in the chilled air, knowing full well that she was walking away not to surrender, but to prepare for the final, decisive battle of her heart. The final grand ball of the London season transformed the magnificent ballroom of the Royal Assembly Rooms into a dazzling palace of crystal light and velvet silk. Hundreds of guests drifted across the polished floor in a sea of glittering jewels and colourful satins, the air thick with the scent of crushed roses and expensive perfumes. Yet, amidst the glittering splendour, Rosalind Fairchild moved with the quiet grace of a woman who had finally stepped out from the shadows. She had arrived not as a working artisan slipping through the side doors, nor as a timid guest hiding behind a velvet curtain. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue silk, unadorned by ostentatious lace, carrying herself with the absolute poise of an equal. Her mind was entirely made up. The letter from Paris remained unanswered on her desk. She refused to cross an ocean based on a half-truth, and she refused to let the man she loved suffer in noble, self-imposed silence. Across the expansive room, standing near a towering marble pillar, Julian watched her. He was trapped in a circle of foreign dignitaries, nodding politely at conversation he could not hear, his dark eyes locked entirely on her. The sight of her standing so proudly in the center of the room sent a sharp, aching jolt through his chest. He believed tonight was her final farewell before her departure, the painful punctuation mark at the end of their tragic, unspoken romance. When Rosalind turned her gaze directly toward him, cutting straight through the glittering sea of high society, Julian felt the world simply stop turning. Without hesitation, she walked straight toward him. The murmurs of the surrounding debutantes and gossiping dowagers faded into a meaningless hum as she closed the distance. She stopped just inches away from the Duke of Hawksbury, her chin held high, her eyes shining with fierce, undeniable courage. The sweeping melody of the orchestra began to swell, signaling the final, traditional waltz of the evening. Rosalind looked up into his stunned, weary eyes, and she took the first step. "You taught me how to find a sanctuary, Your Grace," Rosalind said, her voice clear and steady over the rising notes of the violins. She extended her hand, her fingers resting lightly, invitingly against his sleeve. "Will you grant me the final waltz, or must I ask twice?" For a single heartbeat, the impeccably polished mask of the Duke of Hawksbury completely shattered. The heavy armor he had worn for 32 years simply dissolved into dust, replaced by an overwhelming, incandescent wave of pure relief and fierce, unconquerable joy. A breathtaking, genuine smile broke across his face, the first true, unguardable smile she had ever seen. "Never, Rosalind," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he immediately captured her hand, his fingers curling around hers with absolute reverent finality. "I would never make you ask twice." He swept her effortlessly onto the grand, open floor, the heavy burdens of his title, his estate, and his solitary past instantly falling away. As the sweeping melody of the orchestra enveloped them, Julian pulled her securely against his chest, his strong hand resting firmly and safely on her waist. The warmth of his touch chased away every lingering shadow of doubt. They moved together in perfect harmony, a seamless rhythm born of deep mutual respect and unspoken years of pining. The glittering ballroom around them blurred into a wash of soft light and color. Julian could no longer hide behind his fears, nor could he pretend that love was a risk to their bond. As they spun beneath the crystal chandeliers, he looked down at her with an absolute devotion that required no further words. "I love you, Rosalind," Julian confessed softly, the words tumbling out of him like a heavy gate finally flung open to the sun. Not as a fragile piece of art, not as a quiet confidant, but as my whole world. You are my home. Please, do not leave me. Rosalind looked up into his eyes, tears of absolute joy shimmering on her lashes, her heart overflowing with a sense of profound belonging. I am not leaving, Julian, she whispered, her voice fierce with absolute certainty. I am right where I belong. As the final lingering chord of the waltz echoed through the grand hall, Julian pulled her into a tender, deeply emotional first kiss. It was a promise of all the quiet mornings, the shared studio light, and the enduring safe haven they would build together. At that exact moment, the delicate silk fan with painted flowers slipped from her loose grip, dropping softly to the polished wooden floor between their feet, entirely forgotten as they stepped together into the beginning of their forever. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming Regency romance. If you enjoyed the journey of Julian and Rosalind, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more comforting, clean romance stories. Leave a comment below, letting us know your favorite moment from their story, and gently settle in for our next tale of love, art, and finding your true sanctuary. Until next time, may your days be filled with warmth and peace.